Upon reaching as far east as the God's Eye, the Lannister host had found itself deeply overextended, and as a result, enemies had begun moving in on all sides. To the north, the warlord Roderick Dustin had crossed Moat Cailin with 2,000 of House Stark's winter wolves, whereupon he had crossed the Twins and been joined by 200 knights and 600 men-at-arms of Lord Forrest Frey, and 300 crackshot archers from Raventree Hall. Meanwhile, to the south, the Riverlords defeated by the late Jason Lannister had regrouped under the leadership of his killer, Sir Pate of Longleaf. Finally, in the immediate west, yet more black supporting Riverlords, such as Garibaldi Grey, John Charlton and Benjicott Blackwood, had mustered together a coalition force. Overall, the Lannister force was being encroached upon on 3 sides, and had a lake, the God's Eye, to their back. Realizing his perilous situation, Lord Humphrey sent raven after raven to nearby Harrenhal, where Prince Aemond and his dragon still occupied the castle, unaware of his allies' predicament. However, these ravens were all shot down by the expert marksmen of Raventree Hall. The next morning, the battle was joined, with Lord Dustin's winter wolves leading the charge into Lannister lines. Drawing up into a square phalanx with their backs to the river, the Lannister bannermen held the line, even as the Freys and the Riverlords joined the fray, forcing them to fight on all sides. 5 times the allied Black Coalition crashed against Lannister spears, and 5 times they were repulsed. However, each time the Blacks attacked, the Lannister phalanx was pushed closer and closer to the water's edge. Finally, those in the back were pushed into the lake and began drowning in their armor. A panic ensued, which evolved into a general rout, leading to the entire Lannister army being slaughtered or drowned. The battle by the lakeshore was the bloodiest single conflict in the Dance of the Dragons, with Maester records estimating anywhere between 2,000 to 10,000 casualties. With the entire Lannister army annihilated, the ever-opportunistic Iron Islanders took to their longboats, allying with Queen Rhaenyra and beginning to mercilessly plunder the now undefended coastlines of the Westerlands. With many of the Green's principal allies crippled, and Lord Aemond and Sir Criston's main army overstretched in Harrenhal, the capital of King's Landing had been left largely undefended. Seeing a golden opportunity before her, Queen Rhaenyra mounted atop Syrax, accompanied by her uncle-husband Daemon riding atop Caraxes. While the 2 massive dragons approached the Red Keep from the landward side, Lord Corlys Velaryon sailed into the gullet and blockaded the city by sea. From inside the city, Queen Mother Alicent scrambled to organize a desperate defense, but with few troops and no dragon riders at her disposal, there was nothing she could do. Knowing she had no other recourse, Alicent surrendered the city to Rhaenyra. In return for handing over Queen's Landing bloodlessly, the Queen Mother was spared, as was her daughter-in-law Queen Helena. But her father, Otto Hightower, alongside many other lords, were not so lucky. The capital now secured, Queen Rhaenyra took her seat upon the Iron Throne of Westeros. The loss of the capital sent Sir Criston and Aemond reeling, and they decided to respond by splitting up. Sir Criston would head south to reinforce Ormond Hightower in the Reach. Aemond, meanwhile, would mount atop Vagar and proceed upon a spree of utter devastation, putting the Riverlands to the torch, hoping this carnage might draw out one of the Black's dragon riders to face him. Proceeding south in Aemond's wake, Sir Criston's armies witnessed nothing but a blackened, dead land. That is, until they reached Crossed Elms, where they were ambushed by Lord Dustin's Winter Wolves and the River Lords. In what would later become known as the Butcher's Ball, Sir Criston was slaughtered alongside the rest of his army. This was the high point for Rhaenyra in the war. She held the capital, had crippled the Green's armies in battle after battle. Yet these triumphs would be fickle things, and the Black Queen's triumphs would soon turn to ashes in her mouth. Despite their many losses, one relatively intact army of the Greens remained, that of Ormond Hightower. Despite the odds, Lord Hightower, accompanied by Prince Daeron and his dragon Tessarion, had scored a string of victories against Black's supporters in the Reach, and was now advancing upon King's Landing. En route, they found out that the townsfolk of Bitterbridge had killed the king's youngest son, Maelor Targaryen, who had passed through there after being smuggled out of King's Landing following its fall. In a vengeful fury, Dairen subjected the town to a brutal sack. To deal with Ormond and Dairen's advance, Rhaenyra deployed an army and 2 of the Dragon Seeds, Ulf the White and Hugh Hammer, to hold the line at the town of Tumbleton. However, when Ormond and Dairen arrived upon the town, it was clear their force greatly outnumbered the blacks within the walls. Hedging their bets, the 2 former peasants-turned-dragon riders turncoated and switched sides to help sack the town. In the ensuing battle, Ormond Hightower was slain, but the Greens were victorious. Upon hearing of Ulf and Hugh's betrayal, Queen Rhaenyra began questioning the loyalty of the other 2 Dragon Seeds, Nettles and Adam of Hull. She ordered them arrested, but due to the covert aid of Corlys Velaryon, who had since adopted Adam as a member of his house, the pair managed to escape with their dragons. As punishment for undermining her orders, Rhaenyra had Corlys imprisoned. The Black Queen would suffer another setback when King Aegon II finally made his reappearance. Having been smuggled out of King's Landing some time ago, he had since recovered from the wounds he'd suffered at Rook's Rest. He landed on the barely garrisoned Dragonstone, where he was found by the still wounded Sunfire. Together, the reunited dragon and rider seized Dragonstone, ironically making it so that both factions had gained the enemy's capital but lost their own. While all this was happening, Daemon had returned to Harrenhal, and Aemond was still ravaging the Riverlands. Eventually, the 2 agreed to a duel above the God's Eye. There, the mightiest dragons and dragon riders on either side of the war clashed, mano a mano. According to legend, this thunderous face-off ended when Correctness and Vhagar became locked wing in claw and began plummeting down towards the lake, but not before Daemon leapt from his dragon onto Aemond's and speared his foe through the eye with the Valyrian sword Dark Sister. Both mighty dragons would die in this duel, as would Aemond. Daemon too likely perished, although his body was never found. Meanwhile, back in King's Landing, Queen Rhaenyra's once unshakable footing had begun to dissolve beneath her like so much sand. Queen Helaena, inconsolable after the traumatic deaths of both her young sons, threw herself from Maegor's holdfast, dying in the moat below. Convinced that Rhaenyra had ordered Helaena killed, and beginning to lose confidence that she could protect them from Prince Daeron's approaching army, the small folk of the city began to riot. The mob rapidly grew, fanning out feverishly through the city streets and devouring the force of gold cloaks sent to pacify it. The Black Queen was left without the manpower to quell the rioting, for after learning they had imprisoned their lord, Corlys, the Velaryon fleet abandoned her, depriving her of half her army. All order and good sense evaporated as amidst the carnage, a crazed prophet, known as the Shepherd, began rallying the mob with sermons against dragons, claiming they were demon spawn of the heathen goddess Valyria and the doom of men. Soon he had corralled a massive group of small folk and led them to the Dragon Pit, the massive cavernous building where the Targaryen's dragons were held. Stuck in their pens and unable to fly, the dragons were caught helpless, and although they incinerated many a peasant, they were eventually swarmed upon and put down. 4 worms, Trikos, Morgul, Tyraxes and Dreamfire, perished that day, as did Queen Rhaenyra's 3rd son, Prince Joffrey, who was thrown off the back of his mother's dragon in his futile attempt to ride to the rescue of his own dragon Tyraxes. Subsequently, Syrax, the Black Queen's bonded mount, also died amidst a swarm of riders. Having lost many of her supporters, her son and her dragon, Rhaenyra was forced to flee King's Landing. Back in Tumbleton, the Dragon Seed Hugh had since developed grandiose ambitions of seizing the throne for himself, but he would never get the chance, for the city was ambushed by his fellow Dragon Seed, Adam, who hoped that by killing the 2 betrayers, he could prove his loyalty to Queen Rhaenyra and have the arrest order on him rescinded. This would not go as planned, for Adam would die in the fighting. However, he would take both Hugh and Ulf and their dragons down with him. Prince Daeron would also perish, making the Second Battle of Tumbleton yet another Pyrrhic disaster where both sides lost valuable leaders and dragons. Rhaenyra, meanwhile, had arrived back on Dragonstone, only to find an unpleasant surprise waiting for her, King Aegon II and Sunfire. Here, the Black Queen, whose rebellion had caused the deaths of so many thousands, would meet her end, roasted to a crisp and devoured by Sunfire, who, ancient and tired, died of his long-standing wounds just days later. His arch-nemesis defeated, Aegon proceeded to King's Landing. The city was still in chaos, and the mob had since crowned a random squire, Trystane Truefire, to be their king, on the grounds that he was the late King Viserys' bastard son. However, the forces of Lord Boros Baratheon cleared the rabble out for King Aegon, allowing him to reclaim the Iron Throne. For all intents and purposes, Aegon II had won, but just like Rhaenyra's ostensible victory before him, his triumph would be bitter and fleeting. Although Rhaenyra was dead, her loyalists fought on, seeking to rescue her son, Aegon the Younger, who was presently in King Aegon's captivity, and install him as king to honour what in their eyes was the true succession. At the Battle of the King's Road, a Blacks-aligned coalition of Stark and Tully forces crushed Lord Boros Baratheon's army and advanced upon King's Landing. With Aegon lacking the manpower to face them, the public mood began to turn against him,